Hello, my name is Bob Brown, and it's my privilege to host this show, which is based on the reality that Westborough is a great town filled with interesting people. Many of them are long-term residents who have so many memories and stories about life in Westborough in days gone past. And so your local cable station, Westborough TV, has initiated this series of programs which are designed to reflect upon life in earlier days and to possibly make suggestions about how we can improve life in this fine town for the future. This is another edition of our Westborough story, or my Westborough story. In the past, and in all the past sessions, we've had people who have lived in town, young and old, who have told their stories. But there's another section of town that you don't hear much from. It's dying in people's memories at this particular point. It was known as the Lyman School for Boys. The Lyman School was a state training school which was designed and built to work with delinquent kids sent to it by the courts. In that school, it was our job to see if we couldn't help these kids become better citizens. I became the chaplain there in 1959. I'd been the chaplain down at Walpole at the State Prison and accepted this job in Westborough in 1959. My job as a chaplain was not very clearly defined, but clearly it was to run a church service every Sunday for the kids, to have Bible classes during the week, and to do counseling of individual boys. One of the boys I became very interested in is a boy I want to talk about today. His name was Enoch. Enoch was a great big African-American kid who came out of Roxbury out of very tough living conditions. He lived with his mother and grandmother and 4 other siblings, but there was so little room in the apartment that he slept in the stairwell outside the apartment. He came to Lyman School for the first time in 1954, so he got there well before me. When I saw him, he was in his 3rd trip back to Lyman School. He was a big kid, as I said, but he was not one who was very physically aggressive, although his size really prohibited anybody from wanting to fool around with him. In the 1960s, the Vietnam War broke out. And eventually recruiters began to come to the school to talk about the possibility of recruiting kids who were 17 years or older. The first recruiter that I met was Sergeant Walters. He lived 2 houses down from me. He was a Marine recruiter, a nice guy. And he wanted to talk to Enoch. Enoch seemed anxious to get out of the rut of going back to Roxbury, getting in trouble, and then having to come back to the school. And so he was anxious to talk to Enoch to see if that might be a path out for him. It's a strange path when you have to go to war to get out of a training school. But Enoch could not read or write, and so he could not qualify for the Marine Corps. But eventually an Army recruiter came by and found some reason why he could take Enoch, and so Enoch went off to join the Army. Before he left, he and I made a pact. The pact was that I would write to him at least once a week, and when he got a chance, he would have someone write to me to tell me how he was doing. After his basic training, he very quickly was sent to Vietnam. When he was in Vietnam, he was involved in active combat for 3 tours in Vietnam. But while he was in one of those tours, he came across a situation that he didn't like. And he writes this letter. I'm reading a portion of it to you now. You know, I've often said that war is hell, and I've been to war. Boy, I hate it. But to tell the truth, things are kind of bad here, but they could be better, if you know what I mean. The cavalry is doing one hell of a job over here, and I'd least not kid you. They are praying for a piece of the victory, and it took me a price to see some victory. We have a saying over here, and it goes like this: when I die, I will go to heaven, for I've spent my time in hell already. In that letter, he asked what I could send to him. Well, Rev, to tell you the truth, I don't need anything but a plane ticket home, maybe. But the people over here are living in terrible conditions, and the school could help if they wanted to. You know, Rev, there are few things that move me more but to see the way these people have to live. And I never realized how good I had it until I saw this village of On Key and the orphanage there. If there was any way you could do anything to help this village, I'd really appreciate it. I know you could set up a system of finding some presents and sending them over. Now, I used to read these letters to the boys in the school whenever I got them, in the church services every Sunday. And when I read this letter, this particular one of the boys in the very back of the room stood up and said, "Reverend Brown, can we do something for Enoch?" I said, "What do you have in mind?" And he said, "We'd like to help him. We'd like to collect stuff for him for the orphanage and for the town." So I was not sure what I should say at that particular point, so I took my robe off and laid it on a chair and I said, "All right, let's talk." And so we opened a conversation with about 110 kids about what they felt they could do to help Enoch. And the only rule I made was, I'll send anything you can bring me as long as you guarantee and promise that no one gets hurt in the process of you getting it, and now no stealing is going to take place. And if you can give me that word, then we will send the packages to Enoch. And we did that. We sent enough packages that Enoch was not only able to save the orphanage in On Key and give them things, but he also took on many in the town. In the meantime, I had gone out to several of the churches on speaking engagements and told the story of Enoch, and eventually the individual churches began to respond and say, "Is there some way we can help?" So eventually they got Enoch's address and they were writing to him. There was an interesting letter that he got one day from a woman in a church who he thought, by the inference of the letter, that she thought he was a white kid. And he raised the question with me, would she have thought of me well if she knew I was black? And then he went on to talk a little bit about war, the war over there, where he was having to kill and do the things that he was required to do because he was in the army. But he was also concerned about the war that was taking place over here. He had heard about Dr. King's death and the racial turmoil going on in the streets of Boston. And he really fretted over the fact that he was in war in Vietnam, and while at home there was still war going on there. Eventually, he came across a situation that became very distressful for him. In a firefight one day, he accidentally shot one of his buddies, and he was immediately ordered for court-martial. And he wrote me this letter saying, "Could you write to President Johnson and tell him I didn't really mean to do that? I'm not here to kill anybody. I didn't want to hurt my buddy. I really didn't try to do it on purpose. I really don't want to be court-martialed. I really don't like war. I really would love to be able to join the Red Cross and do something to help people rather than kill people. Could you write President Johnson and get him to save me?" Well, of course, I couldn't do much with President Johnson, but I did call and get in touch with his chaplain, the division chaplain, a remarkable guy, a Reverend Hartman, who went to see Enoch and found out what his situation was and eventually worked it out so he did not get court-martialed. He got sent to another division, and he was again involved in the war. Now, Enoch spent 3 tours in Vietnam, as I said. On one of the last tours, the second tour, at the end of the second tour, he wrote me a note that said, "Can I come home?" And I wrote back and said, "What do you mean? You have a leave? You're going to come back to Roxbury?" And the second letter came from him saying, "No, I mean, can I come back to the school?" And that told us something about what he thought of the way we had handled him there, that now Lyman School was his home. Then I wrote back and said, "Of course you can come back. Give me the dates." So he gave me the dates when he was coming home. And I talked to the superintendent, because the school knew who he was now, and I'd read all the letters that kept coming from him. The letters are just stacks of them that I've kept through all these years. And we decided that the day he would come back to the school, I would go down to Route 9 at the bottom of the Lyman School hill and meet him as he came off the bus. Now let me stop for a moment and explain the school a little bit in terms of layout. If you got off the bus down at the foot of the hill, the Lyman School, you walked up a small grade, and eventually you came to what was called Elms Cottage. It is now Spectrum House. And immediately ahead of you was the administration building, a big white building. And then as you moved up the road further, you came to the chaplain's building. And across the street was the infirmary. And the next building up was the old school building. And finally, on the last part of the hill was the auditorium. We held services in the auditorium, and that's where he was used to going to church. So as I met him, well, we had decided the school would be called off, the recreation programs at the school and all the work programs, and the kids would be kept in the auditorium until Enoch could get there. We weren't sure exactly of the timing, but it was my job to bring him up the hill and walk leisurely with him and talk with him about things and let him see people he had known and talk with them on the way up. And as we got closer to the auditorium, I said, "Would you like to stop in and see where we had church?" And I was hoping he said yes, and he did. We approached the auditorium and we opened the door. It was absolute silence and it was pitch black. There were about 275 kids in the auditorium at that time, along with the staff. And immediately as soon as we opened the door, they burst into a round of applause that would deafen you. I don't mind telling you, it broke me up. And even telling you the story now breaks me up, because I can remember the picture of this kid, this Lyman School kid, now a proud Army officer, walking into this auditorium. And without a hesitation, he moved up to the front of the auditorium and turned and thanked the boys for all they had done in terms of helping him take care of the orphanage in Ankhi and the town of Ankhi. And he explained to them what was hell about war and how troubled he was by having to be there and to shoot people. He would much rather be there to help people. But he had pledged his allegiance to the government and to his service in the Army, and so he was going to fulfill his duties. And he also at the same time said to the boys, "If any of you want to write to me, I'll try to write back to you." Now I had noticed in his letters that the first letters that came obviously were not written by him. But later on, the writing style began to change, and it became a little harder and harder to read. But it turns out that he had now somehow learned how to write a little bit, and he was now sending his own letters back. And he wanted to write to individual boys. He kept saying to them, "You know, if you can do all this work for me in Vietnam and taking care of the kids in that orphanage, then you're finding out how good it feels to be of use to people. You and I were used to hurting people, and we got our jollies out of hurting people. We were called delinquent kids. But we never spent much time trying to help somebody, and we never had the real feeling of what it was like to be of use to somebody else. Well, now you have that feeling, and it feels pretty good, doesn't it?" And the kids say, yeah. Well, that's what I want you to live on. That's what I want you to carry on with your life. If you will carry that on, you will never come back to this place again. And I can tell you that I'm going back to Vietnam. I've got to go back. I've got another tour to do. And I'm going to do my job in terms of working with the Army and being involved in the firefights and all the things that we have to do. But ultimately, I want to help people. I want to work for people. He went back to Vietnam, and eventually I got another letter. One of the proudest letters he ever sent me, and it was filled with this. These were his sergeant's stripes. He had made sergeant, and he was the proudest man you ever want to hear. Until what is written on this thing, you can't read it very well. It says, "To a good friend, F-R-E-N-D, Reverend Brown." And I'll tell you, this means more to me than most anything I've ever gotten. This is a remarkable story about a remarkable kid. He came back to the United States eventually. He got married, lived out in Minnesota, worked at a job in a gambling casino. But the majority of his time was spent on his free time going into high schools, talking to kids about staying off drugs and what it means to be of use to other people and what he had learned by this experience in Vietnam, and praying that they never had to go to anything like that, and praying for them to work for peace and to really be good citizens. And as I say, he went all around the country speaking in high schools about his task. Tragically, Enoch had a stroke several years ago. And I got a letter from his wife saying he can't write anymore because he's had this stroke. And then about 3 days later, he died. Now, Lyman School had a title. It was called a training school. Prisons are called correctional facilities. And that makes it sound as if there's something we as staff can do to make somebody change. That's baloney. And I finally decided after my working at Lyman School and working with kids for a long period of time, what we can best do is not preach at them, not talk to them about all the bad things they've done, but rather simply try to live a life in and amongst them that looked more attractive to them than the life they were that they were living now. And I decided that the way to solve that problem for most kids was to give them the opportunity to serve, to be of some use to somebody else, and let them get that feeling of have someone come up and say, thank you. I remember one day we were doing a foundation on a habitat house here in Westborough, and the job needed to be done was waterproofing the foundation. And I took 3 of the kids and said, would you like to leave, get out of the institution for a little while and go down and work on a house, putting some foundation waterproofing on it? How much are we going to get paid? I said, no, there's going to be no pay. This is something we do just out of community service to help somebody else. Well, I don't know if we want to go. I said, okay, you can stay here. But if you change your mind, I'd be happy to take you down. I'll give you the benefit of we'll go down to Burger King and get hamburgers when you're done. But that's the only pay. All right, so finally 3 of them agreed, and I took them down. And they were in this foundation. It was a hot day. It was in July, and they were slopping this tar on the foundation and not really enjoying it very much at all. But a contractor pulled up and stopped outside, and he walked over to the edge of the foundation, and he said, who are these kids? And I said, there's some kids out that I know that they just volunteered to help. My gosh, they're doing a remarkable job. We could never find kids who would do anything like that. That's remarkable. They're doing just great. And then the fellow turned and left. And as soon as he left, the kids came flying up out of the hole. Did he mean what he said? And I said, what do you mean? Did he mean that we're doing a great job? I said, yeah. How'd that feel? Geez, no one has ever said anything like that to me before. And I said, well, is that a nice feeling? Oh, yeah, that's the best feeling I've had ever. That feels great. Can we do this again? And that, for me, is the beginning of how kids turn themselves around. Enoch went to Vietnam. He went as an Army PFC. He made it to sergeant. He took on the town of An Kee and the orphanage in An Kee. He did his job in jumping as a paratrooper in behind enemy lines. He did his duty to his country. He was a proud American. But he so wished that he could be of help to people rather than hurting people. Enoch is my hero. He is one of the most remarkable human beings I've ever met. Just think of the courage it takes to come out of an apartment where you're living in the hallway, and all you know is the cold of that stairwell, and to come back to Lyman School repeatedly for petty offenses, and then to turn his life around like this. He made a choice, and that's what we're about, trying to help kids make a choice to become non-delinquent. We can't make them do it, but we can give them the opportunity. And as strange as it sounds, Enoch's experience in Vietnam and his opportunity to serve his country and to come across that village of An Kee and to become so important to those people there. Eventually, the chaplain heard about him being in An Kee and saw the packages that were coming, and he called the local radio station. And they came out and did an announcement about Enoch, and eventually the Stars and Stripes picked it up, and he had a big article about what he had done. And he wanted no credit for himself. He kept saying, it's not me, it's the Lyman School boys who did this. They've sent the stuff, and the people in the communities that sent all this stuff to us and made this possible. So it's not my place. Just humble and just loving the opportunity to be the distributor of gifts to them, other people. And he just, I say it again, Enoch is my hero. I miss him terribly, but I hold on to his letters, and I hold on to his memories. And I hope that this helps us keep him in memory here in town. He is a good Westborough story. Thank you.